Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in land law. We are continuing talking about the idea of co-ownership in this lesson. The previous lesson took an introduction to co-ownership, whereas this lesson is going to start talking about the individual component elements of co-ownership. This here in this lesson talking about the joint tenancy and the requirements for the establishment of a joint tenancy. And essentially what we will do is talk about what the requirements are for a joint tenancy. Fundamentally, and as a spoiler alert, these are the four unities. But we will then also talk about the rationale behind this, how this actually pertains to the concept of the joint tenancy in its sort of general abstract form. We know from the previous lesson what the joint tenancy is and how it differs from that of the tenancy in common, and we will explain the rationale behind the four unities as being a key component to this idea of the joint tenancy. So, as I mentioned, the previous lesson introduced the subject of co-ownership. We noted that, among other things, there are two types of co-ownership that exist. We have the joint tenancy, we have the tenancy in common. And like I said, we're going to explore the issue of the joint tenancy in this lesson. So, recapping the previous lesson, the joint tenancy is a situation where we have co-ownership, but it concerns itself with a situation in which the parties to the co-ownership, the various different elements of the co-ownership, each have title to the property in full. And what this essentially means is that they will act as one single unit. Despite the fact that they are still individual people, at least in law, they are representative of one single unit of ownership, and they have that control over the property to the point where there is not this division of share of the property at any point. It is still, for all intents and purposes, a single owner, but only legally is it represented as a single owner, given the fact that there are still other people who own the property, if that makes sense. So it's not like the tenancy in common, where you have co-owners where they each have different parts of the property, and you can clearly delineate each of these different parts of the property, such that you could even address the issue of severance. But when it comes to the joint tenancy, there are co-owners, but collectively and legally they represent a single joint tenancy. So, given the fact that the joint tenancy requires there to be a number of different co-owners, each of which essentially have they have their co-owners, but they each have full ownership of the property. There's no divisible shares on the basis of asking price, for example. There is no possibility of severance within the co-ownership, the joint tenancy situation. What are therefore the requirements for a joint tenancy, given that the co-owners act as a single unit, as a single group, as a single entity? You would understand that there has to be quite a lot of unity between each of the co-owners. And this is what is known as the existence of the four unities. And so to show the joint tenancy, you have to satisfy each and every one of the four unities. There has to, this is discussed, which is something we'll get to in a future lesson in the case of AG Securities and Vorham. This is a case that we will get to, in fact, in more detail when we look at the concept of leases and the leasehold estate, which is actually topic 6. Fundamentally, this is what we discuss in that lesson, in those lessons at least. This case is discussed, but one of the things that this case also does is highlights the existence of the four unities. Now, the four unities are as follows. You have to have a unity of possession. You then also have to have a unity of interest. There then also has to be a unity of title, and then finally a unity of time. In order for there to be a joint tenancy, in order for there to be the satisfaction of a joint tenancy, you must have satisfied, you must have met the four unities. And it also means that in practice, the joint tenancy represents the complete possession on the part of each of the co-owners of land. Each of the co-owners of land represent a complete possession as a single unit. Despite the fact that they are individual people, they represent in law as a single unit. They have the same rights of possession. They also have the same rights of enjoyment as any of the other co-owners in the enjoyment of that property. This is unlike the tenancy in common, where there is a division on the basis of share. Or at least there could be the division on the basis of share. When we talk about joint tenancies, you have co-owners, but each of the co-owners has the same rights of possession and enjoyment over 100% of the property. They have the same rights and possession over the entirety of the property. And so in relation to this, therefore, the four unities are the unity of possession, so each of the co-owners must have possession of the property. They also have to have similar interests in the property, and this therefore represents a single unified purpose for which the property is being utilized for. In a similar sense to the idea of possession, but in a more legalistic term and format, there has to be a unity of title. And then finally, there has to be a unity of time. What do we mean by a unity of time? Well, in order for there to be a satisfactory joint tenancy, there has to be a joint tenancy at all times, essentially. You can't have a situation where there are 3 co-owners and then over the course of a year, let's say, a 4th co-owner joins onto the tenancy, and then at that point we would try to argue that the entire period of co-ownership was a co-ownership in which you have joint tenancy, because there wasn't a unity of time. The co-owners weren't the same co-owners, or at least they weren't the same number of co-owners for the time in which we are trying to argue for. Now, we will get to the law and equity that relates to this topic in future lessons' time, but one of the things that I will note here is that there is a limited number of joint tenants that are able to possess a single property. This is limited in law to 4, and anybody else that exists on the property in relation to that after there are 4 people or 4 entities that are listed on the property as the joint tenants, they will represent tenancies in common, and we'll get to that in future lessons as well. So this is really very simple. This is a very simple way of understanding the joint tenancy. They are represented as a single unity, each being able to enjoy complete possession and enjoyment of the property and have the same rights, the exact, not just the same amount of rights, but the exact same rights as any other of the co-owners of that property. And this is how we get to this idea of a joint tenancy.